Let's look at the question, what percent of 72 is 36? For this problem, we need to make sure we understand what our percent, part, and whole are. Percent, in this case, referring to what we're looking for. The whole, in general, follows the word of, which we interpret as multiplication. And the part, found on the other side of the equation, usually found on the other side of the word is. So in our statement, what percent of 72 is 36? We'll use those terms to translate this into an equation. So what percent we'll interpret as our variable p, of we interpret as multiplication. Now look back and we're saying what percent of 72, that's our whole. So we put it in as 72. Is interpreted as an equal sign and 36 is 36. So to solve our equation, we have 72p equals 36. I'll divide each side by 72. And when I do, my left side will cancel out to 1. 36 divided by 72 can be reduced. Both numerator and denominator can be divided by 36. Which leaves me with the fraction 1 over 2. So 1/2 is my percent. Now I want to change that into a more recognizable form, so 1/2 is equivalent to 0.5. As a percent, I'm going to change it by multiplying by 100. The effect is moving my decimal point 2 spaces to the right, which means I now have the number 50, or in this case 50%. Let's look at the question, what percent of 200 is 50? To solve a question like this, we need to identify our percent, our part, and our whole. Percent is what we're looking for in this case. The whole is the total amount that we consider, and generally follows the word of in these equations. The part, of course, is the portion, and generally follows the word is. So what percent of 200 is 50? We want to set up an equation to solve this. So my equation, what percent we interpret as p, it's our variable, of is interpreted as multiplication, of 200 is 50, so 200 goes down as 200, is interpreted as an equal sign, and 50 is 50. So I have the equation 200p equals 50. Now to solve, I want to isolate my p, so to get rid of my 200, which is multiplied to p, I'll divide by 200. My 200 is reduced to 1, and I'm left with p is equal to 50 over 200. I can reduce each by 50. And I'm left with 1 over 4. Now remember, I want a percent. So first of all, 1 over 4 is 0.25 as a decimal. I can change that to a percent by multiplying by 100. The effect of which is my decimal point moves 2 spaces to the right. I now have the number 25. And I'll attach on my percent sign. Let's look at the question, 42 is what percent of 168? To solve this problem, I want to understand my part, my whole, and my percent. We look for terms like the word of and the word is. Our whole follows the word of, and our part follows the word is. So from this, we can set up an equation. We can say 42 is what percent of 168. We interpret is and of as equal and multiplication respectively. And our percent is our percent, what we're looking for. So start with 42 is, so 42 is 42. Is, we say, is interpreted as an equal sign. Now when I say what percent, I'm looking for, that's my unknown, so I leave it as P. Of is interpreted as multiplication. 168 is 168. So I have 168 times P. I want to solve for it. I need to get rid of my 168. I can do so by dividing each side by 168. Now I want to simplify. I have P is equal to 42 over 168. I want to see if there's anything that can divide into 42 and 168. And the largest number that can do so is going to be 42. "42 goes into 42 once. 42 goes into 168 4 times. Now since I'm still looking for a percent, I'm going to change my 1/4 into a decimal, which is 0.25. I can convert this to a percent by multiplying by 100. The effect is move the decimal point 2 spaces to the right, and I have the number 25, which I will attach a percentage sign to. Let's look at the question, what percent of 120 is 90? To do this, I want to understand my percentage, my part, and my whole. The percentage in this case is what I'm looking for. The whole is the number, or excuse me, is the term that follows the word of, and the part is the term that follows the word is. So what percent of 120 is 90? Now we also interpret the word of as multiplication and is as an equation. What percent is what we're looking for? That will become our variable. So what percent of 120 is 90? Going left to right, what percent is my unknown variable, so I keep it as P. What percent of is interpreted as multiplication. Of 120 is 90. 120 is 120. Is interpreted as the equal sign, and 90 is 90. So I have 120p equals 90. To solve for my variable, I want to get rid of 120, so I will divide by 120. Now I'm left with P, because 120 is reduced to 1, equals 90 over 120. I can divide into 90 and 120. $30 into each. And doing so leaves me with 3 over 4. To change this into a percent, I'll first change 3/4 into a decimal, which will give me 0.75. Then I'll multiply by 100 to change to a percent, the effect of which is move my decimal point 2 spaces to the right. So 75 is my percentage, and I'll add my percentage sign to it. Let's look at the question. 15% of 60 is what number? I want to interpret this statement into an equation by identifying of and is as operations. Of becomes multiplication, is becomes an equal sign. What number becomes my variable? Anytime I see the phrase what and then a term, an expression, that becomes my variable. So if I'm going to change this into an equation, from 15% of 60 is what number? I'm running out of room. %15 is 15%, but in an equation I want to write it as a decimal always. So this becomes 0.15. Of becomes multiplication. 60 is 60. Is my equal sign, and what number is my variable, which I'll call x. So I'm saying x is equal to 0.15 times 60. So I do 0.15 times 60, and it gives me 9. So we say that 9 is equal to x, or 15% of 60 is 9. Let's look at the equation. What is 30% of 90? I should say this question we want to change from a statement into an equation. And we'll do so by understanding that the word is can be translated to an equation, and the word of can be translated to multiplication. The phrase what in this case is going to refer to our variable. It's the same thing as saying what number. So if I set this up as an equation, what is 30% of 90? As I said, what, or it's the same thing as saying what number, so I'll make that my variable. I'll call it x. Is interpreted as an equation. 30%, I need to change to a decimal whenever I involve it in an equation. So I'll say it as 0.3 or 0.30, doesn't really matter. Of is translated to multiplication, and 90 is 90. So this is really saying, what is 0.3 times 90? And doing that, I'll get x is equal to 27. So we say that 27 is 30% of 90. Let's look at the question. What is 145% of 60? With a problem like this, I need to understand that the word is interpreted as an equal sign. The word of is interpreted as a multiplication sign. So from that I can take this statement to an equation. What is the same thing as saying what number. That will become my variable. So what is 145% of 60? So what's 145% of 60? I said what is the same thing as saying what number. That becomes our variable. Is interpreted as an equal sign. I want to use 145%, but I can't use it as a percent. I need to change it to a decimal before I do involve it in this problem. So I move my decimal point 2 spaces to the left. And that gives me the number 1.45. Of is interpreted as multiplication, and 60 is 60. So this is really saying, what is 1.45 times 60? And that becomes 87. So we say that 87 is 145% of 60. Let's look at the question. What is 3 1/5% of 325? I want to change my statement into an equation. And to do so, I need to understand that the word is can be interpreted, or is interpreted, as an equal sign. And the word of is interpreted as a multiplication sign. The phrase what is the same as saying what number, so that becomes my variable. And from that I can change this into an equation that I can solve. So what is 3 1/5% of 125? Excuse me, of 325. That's why you check. So 300, there we go, 25. I said what is interpreted as what number, or is the same, so I change that to my variable, I'll call it x. Is an equal sign. Now to change this into a percent, first let me change 3 1/5 into a decimal form. Let's look at the question. What is 60%? Or excuse me, 60 is 5% of what number? So if I'm going to change this statement into an equation, I want to understand that is interpreted as an equal sign, of is interpreted as a multiplication sign, and the phrase what number refers to my variable. So I'm going to translate it into an equation that I can then solve. So I'm going to translate 60 is 5% of what number? So 60 is 5% of what number? And I'm running out of room. So in my equation, 60 is 60. Is, as I said, is interpreted as an equal sign, so I'll make it equals. 5% I want to include, but I can only include it as a decimal, so I need to change it to a decimal form. Move my decimal point 2 spaces to the left to give me 0.05. Of becomes multiplication. What number is my variable, so I'll call it x. So I'm really looking to solve the equation. 60 equals x times 0.05. If I'm going to solve for x, I need to get rid of 0.05. So I'll divide each side by 0.05. And when I do so, I'll end up with 1200. So we say 60 is 5% of 1200. Let's look at the question. What 200% of what number is 90? To solve this, I need to understand that is interpreted as an equal sign and of is interpreted as a multiplication sign. And the phrase what number refers to my unknown, my variable. So from that, I can build an equation which I can then solve. So again, I'm solving 200% of what number is 90. So I'll write it out. 200% of what number is 90. So as an equation, I want to use 200%, but I can only use it in its decimal form. So to convert to decimal, I'll move my decimal point 2 spaces to the left. So I have 2. Of is my multiplication sign, so multiplication sign. The phrase what number becomes my variable, I'll call it x. Is becomes an equal sign, and 90 is 90. So I'm really looking to solve the equation 2x is equal to 90. To solve for that, I'll divide each side by 2 to isolate my variable x. The 2 is reduced to 1. 90 can be divided by 2 and left with 45. So we say 200% of 45 is 90. Let's look at the question. 32 is 20% of what number? To solve a question like this, I want to understand that is interpreted as an equal sign, of is interpreted as a multiplication sign, and the phrase what number refers to an unknown or a variable. So from that, I can change my statement into an equation. I'm changing. So my statement, again, 32 is 20% of what number? Which I'll write down. I'm going to change this into my equation. So 32 is 32, which I'll make. Is becomes my equal sign. 20% I'll use, but I need to make it a decimal before I use it in my equation. So to change the decimal form means I move my decimal point 2 spaces to the left to give me 0.2 or 0.20, doesn't matter. Of is interpreted as multiplication. Again, the phrase what number refers to my variable, my unknown, so I'll call it x. So really what I'm solving is 32 is equal to 0.2x. So to solve for x, I can divide each side by 0.2. That 0.2 is reduced to 1. So I'm left with 32 divided by 0.2, which comes out to be 160. So we say 32 is 20% of 160. Let's look at the question. What percent of 72 is 36? If I'm going to solve this, I'm going to use the proportion method, which tells me that I want to set up my percent over 100 is equal to the part over the whole. Remember that the whole always follows the word of. And percent is what we're looking for. And the part follows the word is. So following this setup, this is my percent, which I'll refer to as P, over 100 is equal to 36 over 72. My part over my whole. Because remember, with these setups, my whole always follows the word of. So to solve for P, I can cross multiply. So I multiply P times 72, 100 times 36. Gives me the equation 72P equals 3600. So to solve for p, I need to get rid of my 72. So I'll divide each side by 72. On my left side, my p's will cancel out, they'll reduce to 1, so I'm left with p is equal to 50. And doing it this way, I attach on my percentage sign. So my answer is 50%. Let's look at the question. 15% of 60 is what number? I want to solve this using the proportion method, where I use the proportion percent over 100 is equal to the part over the whole. Recall that the whole always follows the word of. So from this I can set up an proportion that I can solve to find my answer. So again, the general formula is the percent over 100 is equal to the part over the whole. In this case, my percent is given, it's 15, and in this setup I do not need to change it to a decimal. I'll leave it as 15 because that's 15% over 100. In this case, my part is unknown, my whole follows the word of, so in this case it's 60. From here, I cross multiply, and I'm left with 100x is equal to 15 times 60, which gives me 900. So, to solve for x, I'll need to get rid of the 100, which means I'll divide each side by 100. My 100s cancel, and 100 goes into 900 9 times, so I'm left with x is equal to 9. So 9 is my answer. 9 is the part that I am looking for. Let's look at the question. 60 is 5% of what number? I want to solve this using the proportion method, where we use proportion percent over 100 is equal to the part over the whole. Remember, in these expressions, the whole comes after the word of. Now in this case, of is followed by what number. Now, what number is always interpreted as a variable, so for right now, the whole is unknown. That becomes our variable. And from this, we'll set up our proportion and solve. So again, it's our percentage over 100 equals the part over the whole. So my percentage that was given me was 5% over 100. Since the whole is unknown, the phrase following the of is what number? We put an x. 60 becomes my part. Now I'll cross multiply. 5 times x gives me 5x. And 60 times 100 gives me 6,000. So to solve for x, I'll divide each side by 5. My 5's canceled and reduced to a 1. And I can divide 5 into 6,005, and I'm left with 1,200. So 1,200 is the whole that I'm looking for in this equation.